Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing. And I think we're right on time to, I guess, kick off Coach Cam's Leading Bite. So as a brief intro for Coach Cam, she is not only a coach on our platform, but also one of our co-founders at KadaKareer. And she is currently pursuing both an MBA and an MS degree at Harvard. Previously, she went to UP and got her bachelor's there and worked for a handful of companies in the Philippines, including Uber, before coming or enrolling in graduate school. So this summer, she actually worked at Amazon as a product manager intern in Seattle, and she just finished up. I'm sure she did a lot of cool things there. And yeah, so today Cam will be sharing her knowledge about data and storytelling with data. And with that, I guess I'll hand it off to you, Cam.
Cool. Thanks, Ian, and thanks everyone for calling in. I know it's pretty late there, so I appreciate your time. So I won't go into details about myself anymore since Ian did a pretty great job. I am gonna share my screen. How does this look? Is it good or is it small? Looks good. Is it filling up your screen? I'm actually not sure.
Just fine.
That looks good. Okay, awesome, nice. So yeah, so I will be talking about storytelling with data. So as a disclaimer, this is actually something that you could learn through a book that is actually called Storytelling with Data, and I'll share the links to that later on after this session. But essentially, I guess the thing is that nowadays we always have just so much access to data, but the thing is having all the information in the world doesn't really make it easier to communicate. It actually makes it very harder. So the more information that we're dealing with, the more information becomes difficult to filter down to what the most important bits are. And this talk is all about just being able to visualize data and tell stories, to turn that information into better decision making for your organizations or within your teams. Yeah, and so I'll start with that. So basically, there will be 4 things that I hope you'll take away from the session. So the first is that context is everything. So I'll share about the concept of the big idea and what a 3-minute story is. Second is that the right graph isn't actually the most complicated one. It's essentially the one that's easiest to read. Third is essentially decluttering and making sure that everything that you present brings value. And then last bit is essentially I'll teach you guys about proattentive attributes and how to use that to be able to focus your audience's attention. So why is it important? Why is storytelling with data important? So first is you have to control the narrative. Sometimes when you show a graph and you're not able to emphasize things well, what happens is it's up for interpretation. And so audiences might take away something different from what you actually want them to take away from the data that you're showing. One other big thing is essentially getting buy-in quickly. And this is something that I feel is one of the key benefits of storytelling with data. When you're able to share your conclusions in a very concise manner, it just helps for all of your stakeholders, especially if you're presenting to someone who's a CEO or your boss, to make their decisions faster. And that makes your work easier. And the last thing is basically it helps you execute faster. When people spend less time arguing and debating about data, that just leads to faster execution. So when will storytelling data exactly be useful? So I used to work for a startup, and so these are our chief technology officer on the left, chief financial officer on the middle, and our CEO on the right. And I would use this all the time. So one is essentially, let's say you want something built or maybe you have a specific request. So, and back in the day, I would say, yeah, like you want to build X because we saw that. So this is a perfect use case for using your storytelling with data skills. When you're trying to request for a budget, so that could be like you're, maybe doing a project and you want to get approval for a certain amount. Or last is maybe you just want to influence strategy. You're trying to make the case for prioritizing something else. And so this is a perfect use case for that as well. So I think we should be doing X because, and so hopefully what you'll learn from the next few minutes will be useful, even outside of these specific use cases. So this may sound counterintuitive, but success in data visualization actually doesn't start with data visualization. So rather you begin down the path of creating a data visualization or communication. You should first understand the context that you want to communicate. So specifically, you need to concisely articulate who you want to communicate to and what you want to convey before you even start building your content. So before we get into even the specifics of content, one important distinction I wanted to draw is exploratory and explanatory analysis. Exploratory analysis is what you do to understand the data and figure out what might be like noteworthy or interesting to highlight. So let's say like in this case, you happen to find, let's say like 100 pieces of data, and you can look at that in 100 different ways. And that's what it is on the left, right? But what you really want to do when you're storytelling with data is that when you're at the point of communicating your analysis to your audience, you want to be very specific. You want to be already in the explanatory phase. And what that means is you already have a specific thing that you want to explain and a specific story that you want to tell, specifically only about from those 100 pieces of data that you found. There were like 2 or 3 things that you found that were actually insightful. And so that's like the big difference here, right? Like on the left, you can do interpret this in so many ways, but out of these specific, out of like the data that you looked at, there are only specific things that you want them to take away. So yeah, resist the urge to show your entire analysis. It can be super tempting to want to show your audience everything, like show like the evidence of all the work you did. But you have to concentrate and I guess like avoid sharing all of the analysis that went into your actual analysis, which is a little counterintuitive. Yeah, so when it comes to explanatory analysis, there are a few things to think about, and you need to be extremely clear on before visualizing any data or creating content. So first is figure out to whom are you communicating. It's important to have like a really good understanding of who your audience is and how they perceive you. So this helps you identify common ground. That'll help you ensure they hear your message. So second is what do you want your audience to know? Like you have to be very clear about what action you want your audience to take. And that should be taken into account when you communicate to them. And then it's only when you know these first 2 things on who your audience is and what action you want them to take that you can already actually move forward with the third, which is how can you use data to help make your point? So stakeholders, action, and then the data. And with every story that you want to share with data, you should always want your audiences to know or do something. If you can't concisely articulate that, then you should actually revisit whether you need to communicate in the first place. When it really isn't appropriate to recommend an action explicitly, try to encourage discussion toward one and suggest possible next steps. So these are just some samples of prompts of action words that you could use. So maybe it could be like you want them to agree to something, begin, believe, change, understand, validate, report, etc. Now that you have like the context pinned down, it's time to think about like the so what. So this is a great way to ensure that you're clear on and can articulate the story that you want to tell. So being able to do this removes you from dependence on your slides or your visuals for a presentation. Uh, so this is useful in a situation where your boss asks you, "No, what are you working on?" Or you find yourself in the elevator, and then one of your colleagues or stakeholders just asks you to give a quick rundown of your work. So think about your 3-minute story. If you only have 3 minutes to tell your audience what they need to know, what would you say? And then also think about the big idea. So essentially, what is the so what in a single sentence? So these are just sort of like heuristics that you could use to see whether you know the so what of what you want to share with your story. So that was the first takeaway. Context is everything. The second takeaway that I want you to get is basically the right graph is the one that's actually easiest to read. But it's never a pie chart. So I will share this video. Let's see. Oh wait, you can hear this. How do I do this? I'm not sure how to share sound. Actually, let me my 1 sec.
I think you can share sound. Like.
Hello, everybody.
Oh,
My name is
no.
Mariana Santos, and
How do I do this?
hello, everybody.
Cool. Yes. So please never use a pie chart. Yeah. So instead of using a pie chart, yeah. So honestly, there are many different graphs that you could use, but there's only actually a handful that would work for a majority of your needs. So some of my favorites are simple text. Second could be like a line graph, simple tables. Again, your bar charts, which are super versatile, scatter plots, and your heat maps. So choosing like which graph you or chart do you want to use actually depends on what you're trying to show. So if you're trying to show a distribution, then you use a histogram, which is essentially like the type of bar chart. If you want to show a relationship between two variables, then that's when you use a scatter plot. If you want to show the composition, if it's over time, you use the stacked vertical bar. If it's static, that's when you use a vertical bar. If it's essentially an accumulation, you want to show the changes in time, that's when you use a waterfall. And then etc. And then if you want to show like a comparison, that's when you either use a line chart to show comparison over time. And then if it's versus categories, then you use a vertical bar or horizontal bar chart. So this isn't exhaustive. I could share the list. It's from the source here, but this is just sort of one guide. Essentially, choosing the right graph is totally dependent on what you want to show. If it's not as though like you just choose the graph first and then sort of find, okay, does this look good? So distribution, relationship, composition, and comparison. So usually I have like a sort of like a game after this, but I'll stop. I won't do that. So just a quick reminders. Things to never use: pie charts, just don't. Donut charts, it's very difficult. Again, like in the video, it's very difficult to compare arc lengths. And then never ever use 3D. It introduces a lot of unnecessary chart elements. And so it becomes confusing to compare like the different data points when you add that other dimension. So we'll go through like the simple, the different types of charts that you could use, or graphs. And then, like I mentioned, right, simple text, sometimes simple text works. When you have just a number or two to share, simple text can be like a really great way to communicate. So you have to think about solely using the number, making it as prominent as possible, to really clearly drive your point. But also, like, it could be potentially misleading. But sometimes when you put your numbers in a table or a graph, it's just simply it causes the numbers to lose their oomph. So like one of like my favorite examples is here on the right. Which one do you think drives the point across better? So arguably, like, it could be the one on the right. So if you want, like, if it's more for say stylistic and sort of like really driving a specific point or like a number, sometimes simple text is all you need. So again, tables. So tables, they actually interact with our verbal system, which means that we actually read them. So when I have a table in front of me, I typically have my index finger out and I'm reading across rows and down columns, or I am comparing values. And that's what tables are great for. You're communicating to a mixed audience whose members will actually look for their particular row of interest. So one thing to keep in mind with the table is that you want the design to fade into the background. So you have to let the data take a center stage. So don't use heavy borders or shading. They compete with the attention of the audience. So instead, use light borders or simply white space to set apart the elements of the table. And then you should always think about pushing your borders to the background. You could make them gray or get rid of them altogether. And then for heat maps, which is a specific kind of table, to reduce this mental sort of processing that audiences do, you can use color saturation to provide those visual cues instead of using different kinds of colors, right? So example on the right, use different colors. I'm trying to interpret what does yellow, blue, green mean, as opposed to the right, where it's very easy already to see what the points of interest are from this specific table. Next is a scatter plot. So while tables interact with our verbal system, so graphs actually interact with our visual system. So it's fast, which makes it faster to be interpreted or processed. And that means that a well-designed graph will typically get the information across more quickly than a well-designed table. So scatter plots, as I mentioned, can be useful for showing the relationship between two things. It allows you to encode the data simultaneously on horizontal x-axis and a vertical y-axis and see whether a relationship exists. So some things that you could use to tweak your scatter plots, of course, size. So that would be like your bubble chart, color to emphasize specific points, or could also be opacity. And then again, so the one specific thing for scatter plots, if you're trying to establish a causation, and then of course, like when you do your regressions and everything, that doesn't necessarily mean causation, but you want to make sure that the independent variable is in the x-axis. Okay, the next one will be your line graphs, essentially your time series. So line graphs are mostly commonly used for plotting continuous data. So because the points are physically connected via the line, it implies a connection between the points that may not make sense for categorical data. So categorical data is basically like, a set of data that's sorted into different categories, right? So this is not for that. Often continuous data, it could be, usually in some unit of times, it could be days, months, quarters, years. So essentially, you would use this for answering the question, is metric X changing over time? And then again, time must be plotted in the x-axis. And then specifically, make sure that your time is plotted in consistent intervals. So this is just like a rule of thumb. I'm pretty sure you guys followed already, but just a reminder. Okay, so bar. Bar is actually one of my favorite charts. Bar charts are, I guess some people would avoid bar charts because they're common, but that's actually a mistake. Bar charts should be leveraged because they're common. And this means there's less of a learning curve for your audience. They're very easy to read. Our eyes compare the endpoints of the bars. So it's very easy to quickly see which category is the biggest, which is the smallest, also see the incremental difference between categories. On the figure in the right, so if you see the yellow bar charts, what looked like a huge increase on the right is actually reduced when you plot it appropriately. Right? So there was a set that because of sort of like what I put in the y-axis, it changed sort of like the integrity of the data, or what the data actually said. So this is just something that we need to take into account. Because of the way our eyes compare the relative endpoints of the bars, it's important to have the context of the entire bar to be there in order to make an accurate comparison. So make sure that the baseline is a 0. And then this only applies for bar charts. This does not apply to line graphs. With line graphs, you can get away with a non-zero baseline. But essentially for bars, please never mislead your audiences. Ensure that you have a 0 baseline. But the one like single go-to for categorical data, I would say, is the horizontal bar chart. So this just flips the vertical version. And again, why? Because it's extremely easy to read. The horizontal bar chart is essentially useful if your names or category names are long, and as long as the text is written from left to right, as most audience read, making your graph legible is super easy. It's also because the way we typically process information. So usually you would start from the top left and make Z's with your eyes across the screens on the page. The structure of the horizontal bar chart is exactly the way that our eyes hit that Z. So it hits the category names before the actual data. This means by the time we get to the actual data, we already know what it represents. So instead of darting back and forth between the data and the category, which is typical with like a vertical bar chart. And then just be very mindful about the logical ordering of your categories. So sometimes it would be great if you could make sure that it's descending or ascending order depending on what the biggest category or smallest category is. And then a stacked horizontal bar is just another sample of a horizontal bar chart. So essentially, it's used to show the totals across different categories. It gives a sense of the subcomponent pieces. And then for this to be useful, just make sure that it has to sum up to 100%. This is very helpful for when you have your Likert scales, especially when you do surveys. So this is one to use. Oops. Cool. So that's the second takeaway. Third is essentially how to declutter, and you do that by asking, does this bring value? So this is just a meme. Essentially, yeah, if it sparks joy, then it's well visualized data. If it doesn't spark joy, just remove it. And then you obviously that I have a vendetta against pie charts. But seriously though, is that what you want to make sure of is that every single element that you add to your page or screen um, is actually useful. So whenever you add something, and this also applies to like an app, like in UX, it takes up cognitive load on the part of your audience. So in other words, it takes brain power to process. So whenever you make another visualization, what you want to do is you have to take like a very discerning look at the visual elements that are there, and then really see if there is something that doesn't add value, it isn't adding informative value, or then just remove it. So clutter is basically any visual element that takes up space but doesn't increase your audience's understanding. There's a simple reason why we aim to reduce clutter. It's simply because it makes your visuals appear more complicated than necessary. And also you run the risk of your audience deciding that they don't want to take the time to understand what you're showing, which is the worst thing that could happen, right? If you show them too many things, they're just gonna give up, and at that point you've lost your ability to communicate with them, and that's not a good thing. And then so how you how when it comes to like audiences and how you identify elements in your visuals, so you would want to consider Gestalt's principles of visual perception. Essentially, it's how individuals perceive order in the world around them. So so the principles of visual perception are still accepted today, and basically it defines how people interact with and create order out of visual stimuli. So there are like 6 principles. We'll go through them very quickly. So one is proximity. We tend to think of objects that are close, they're physically close together as belonging to a part of a group. Here you naturally see that these 3 dots, 3 distinct dots, are one group just because of their relative proximity to each other. The second is similarity. So objects of the similar color, shape, size, or orientation are also perceived as related or belonging to a part of a group. So you naturally associate the blue circles here together on the left, and you associate like the gray squares together on the right. Enclosure, so you think of objects that are physically enclosed together as belonging to part of a group. So it doesn't take like a strong enclosure to do this. So the light background here is enough, as opposed to even just like an actual enclosure. Closure is essentially a concept that says that people like things to be simple and to fit into the constructs that are already in our heads. So because of this, people perceive a set of individual elements as a single recognizable shape when you can. And here it's like essentially like the circle. For example, here we tend to perceive the circle first before the individual elements, right? So that's closure. And then continuity, essentially, when we are looking at objects, we or at least our eyes seek the smoothest path and naturally create continuity even in what we see, even if it may not explicitly exist. So here you already assume that it would become 2 as opposed to 3, and so you already assume that kind of continuity. And last is connection. So essentially it says that we tend to think of objects that are physically connected as part of a group. So even if these things have different colors, you would still associate them as part of a group. So it has a stronger associative value than color, size, or shape. So how do you apply those to declutter your graphs and charts? So proximity, leverage proximity when you design your tables. So simply by, differentiating the spacing between the dots, your eyes here are already drawn either down the columns or in the second case across the rows, right? So that's just by virtue of proximity. Use similarity also when you leverage your tables. So it helps you draw your audience's eyes in the direction that you want them to focus. So here, similarity of color is a cue for your eyes to read across the rows rather than down. So it eliminates the need for additional elements such as borders. So you could totally just do away with borders completely. Enclosure, again, so it's a way to draw a visual distinction with your data. So you could use like maybe like a specific color to emphasize a different section of the data. Closure, so it's common for like graphing applications, let's say in Excel, to have a default setting that includes like the border of the chart, right? Like there's going to be like the black border, but we actually don't need it. The closure principle already tells us that it's unnecessary. So you can remove those like default borders because your graph still appears as a cohesive entity. Continuity. So here specifically, I removed the vertical y-axis line from the graph altogether, right? But your eyes actually still see the bars as lined up at the same point because of the consistent white space. So essentially that smoothest path between the labels on the left and the data on the right. So that's one way of using continuity. And then last is connection. So one way that we leverage this usually is through line graphs. Here, you're just saying that, you're able to help your audience's eyes see the order in the data with that line. So let's practice. Can you give me any ideas on how we can improve these charts? How about, okay, I will cold call. How about you, Carl? Any tips or any ideas on how we can declutter these graphs?
Wait, I'll think muna. Sorry, wait.
No problem. Bea.
I'm not really sure, but like maybe we could take out the numbers that are on the bars themselves. I think they're quite confusing, but I don't know. Whatever you think, Cam.
Right. No, that's completely correct. Like remove the data markers. So remember, every single element adds cognitive load. Here we're adding extra cognitive load to process the data, especially because the data is already, visualized with the lines. So that this isn't to say that you should never use data markers, but rather use them on purpose and with a purpose. So if there is a specific point, like a data point here that actually you wanted to emphasize, and that's when you use a data marker. But having data markers for all of it is unnecessary. And then for the sake of time, I'll go through the rest. So one is you could remove the chart border, as I mentioned. It's unnecessary. You already think of these as a cohesive element. Remove the grid lines. Actually, if you think it'll be helpful for your audience to trace their finger from the data to the axis, or if you feel that your data will be more effectively processed with the grid lines, that's fine, leave it. But make them thin and use a light color like gray. Don't let them compete visually with your data. Clean up the axis label. So here on the left, one of my biggest pet peeves are trailing zeros. So remove trailing zeros wherever it is that in any chart. Yeah, and then last thing is just leverage consistent color. make sure that the data labels have the same color as the data they describe. So pro tips: remove the chart border, be very comfortable with white space, remove grid lines. You could remove the data markers, clean up the access labels, and use consistent color. Last thing, how do you focus your audience's attention? Can you tell me in the next 6 seconds how many threes there are in this chart? Shout it out when you do.
5.
5. So actually there aren't 5. Any other guesses?
6.
6.
Yeah, so there are 6. Yes.
Damn it.
Yeah, it's confusing. It's hard, but when you use correct use of color, how many
Actually, there's
threes are
7
there? Oh, are there 7?
from
Or
the
is another
header.
3? Oh, okay. Oh my gosh. Now I got stumped. I was like, wow, I didn't even see that there was 7th one, but that's true. So this was a trick question. There are actually 7, not 6. Yeah, but then so basically that exercise was just to share that when you don't have, like, basically, like, it's so much faster when you use the power of pre-attentive attributes, and here I specifically use color. It's profoundly very powerful, and we'll talk more about it on what other pre-attentive attributes you can use. So yeah, you enable your audience to see what you want them to see even before they know what they're seeing. So note that as you scan across the attributes, your eye is drawn to one element within each group, and that's different from the rest. You don't have to look for it. It's your brain is already doing all of the processing. It's hardwired to quickly pick up those differences you see in your environment. So when used sparingly, pre-attentive attributes can be extremely useful for doing 2 things. First, draw your audience's attention quickly and focus your audience's attention to where you want them to look. And second is creating a visual hierarchy of information. So orientation by changing it, shape, line length, line width, just even curvature, size, hue, intensity. You create that focus on specific elements. So how to use pre-attentive attributes in the way we process information, and specifically blocks of text. So essentially, just choose one pre-attentive attribute and then use that. And then that already will grab the audience attention. And some attributes may grab or draw your eyes with greater or weaker force than others, but essentially they're all pretty helpful. So some of the things, for example, here with none, then you can see if I just put in bold our mission, that automatically draws your eyes to that. If you use color, you suddenly see uplift the lives of Sari store owners. Italics, communities they serve, size, our employees, separating them spatially, putting an outline or an underline, right? So just by that one pre-attentive attribute, I was able to change the way you read each block of text, even if they actually had the same data. So make use of pre-attentive attributes to create visual hierarchy in your communication. You use the information so that it becomes easily scannable. So studies have shown that, we only about 3 to 8 seconds with our audience, during which time they have already decided whether to continue to look at what you're presenting in front of them or direct their attention to something else. And when you use our pre-attentive attributes wisely, you're able to already say what you want to say within those initial 3 to 8 seconds. So here on the right, leveraging pre-attentive attributes, it shows already a clear visual hierarchy of information. You signal what is most important that they should pay attention to, first, second important, and then next, and so on. So you can push necessary but non-message impacting components to the background so that they don't compete for attention. This makes it easier and faster for your audience to take in the information that you provide. So in-app feedback auto ticket, that's like the main gist of this entire bullet, etc. So how do you use this with graphs? So this can be very much like the threes exercise that we had a while ago. So note that how without any other visual cues, in this specific graph, you're actually processing all of this information on your own. You don't have any clue on what's important, what you should pay attention to. Essentially, it's kind of like you're counting the threes all over again. What happens though when you use your explanatory analysis and leverage the visuals to share information with your audience rather than just showing the data? So you can use color and text as illustrated in this chart on the right. So from here, suddenly you actually have a takeaway, right? So you're matching the color, the takeaway with also the specific pieces of information. We use data markers only for the ones that we want to emphasize. It's this clearer. So general guidelines on how to draw the audience's attention, push everything to the background, and then once you have, make the data stand out. So specifically, what pieces of information do you want to emphasize? And then again, use data labels sparingly. So you just remove the data markers for the other data points that were irrelevant to our key takeaway. So yeah, what are some important pre-attentive attributes? Size, it denotes relative importance. Make sure that the most important thing is the biggest one. Color, design. I prefer this design in shades of gray. Then just pick a single bold color, and that's what you use to emphasize those data points that you want to emphasize. So maybe your company has like a brand color or something, and then you can use that. So quick recap of what we learned. Context is everything. So essentially you know what your big idea is and what your three-minute story is. Second, the right graph is the one that's easiest to read. Most likely it will not be a pie chart. Third is always declutter. Does this bring value? And then fourth is always focus your audience's attention using pre-attentive attributes. Then the thing is the takes practice. So look for opportunities to apply the lessons you've learned. And yeah, find inspiration from good visuals and consider how you would use it for your day-to-day work and your own use. All right, yeah, so that's the end of my learning bite. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, go forth and visualize data, and then you can spend the last few minutes for any questions you might have it.
Thank you. So thank you, Cam, for that wonderful learning bite. Thankfully, we have a few minutes left for any questions that our participants might have for Cam, because her presentation was so comprehensive, and I'm pretty sure everybody has questions they want to ask. So please do type your questions in the chat, and then I'll be reading them out to Cam. To get us started, though, I wanted to personally ask Cam, what pushed you to be so interested in data? Because you seem very passionate and you really know your stuff about it. So yeah, I want to know what started it all.
I'm not really sure. I think it's just really relevant throughout my work, and I think everyone's work. And in particular, right? So for the other coaches, Coach Charles and Coach Rafael. So I actually lead the design team in KadaKareer. So I'm not even the data person, but I think design just really works well with data. And I think that was kind of how I got interested in data visualization in particular. But yeah, it's just very relevant throughout my work. So I was in sales before, so I had to do persuasive selling. When I moved to operations in Uber, I had to share the pain points of our users, and most likely it would be more powerful with like a yeah, with data, with graphs. And then yeah, essentially it's just good practice also in general. When eventually I was in grocery, I just hated it when people would, make these graphs that were not understandable. So I found the need to just help others also visualize better.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Cam. So, I've got a question. So Anya is asking, what are some things to watch out for to tell if data is being manipulated? Sorry. Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, so like the access labels are one. Sorry, the baseline is like a big thing, right? Sometimes people just show a section of the data, or like show, yeah. So anyway, baseline essentially. Always make sure that you have like a zero baseline. Second is like maybe some people will show like the percentages without like absolutes. So that could be one thing. Sometimes they're trying to blow up something that's actually quite insignificant. So, you can say like, oh, 180% improvement. But if it only impacts a certain portion of the business or a certain portion of the population, then that could be quite misleading. What are some other quick things that I usually ask? Yeah, and then of course, like one of the biggest things is like, or maybe not misleading, but like not when it's data is not helpful when you don't compare it to another time frame. So you could say like, oh, we have like, I don't know, 1,000 signups this week, but how does it compare? How does it compare to her competitors or to a previous period? So not having those comparisons is always misleading, and you'll always find your boss asking you like, what's the index? How does this compare to something else? So those are some things to watch out for.
Amazing. Okay. Yes, Anya showing a heart, so her question was answered. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions that they want to bring up to Coach Cam? We'll give it a bit more. Going once, going twice, going thrice. All right. Okay, so I think that's it, Coach Cam. Thank you so much for your learning bite. Can everybody show Coach Cam some love through the chat? Just give her a thank you, show a little gratitude for the wonderful presentation that she has prepared. So yes, there's a lot of hearts going around for you. Thank you, Cam. Okay, so that wraps.
Awesome.
Thank you. Okay, so that wraps up the learning bite that we have prepared for tonight. One last thing though, before everyone leaves, we would really appreciate, the coach engagement team would really appreciate if you guys could give us feedback through this form that I've already put in the chat. So just let us know, like if you thought this learning bite was effective, fun, and if you would like for us to improve anything in the future. So yeah, that's it. And to end the night, we'd like to just end with the small KadaKareer tradition that we like to call gratitude shower. So just before you exit the room, please do leave at least one thing in the chat that you're grateful for this week, and also just share a bit of love for Cam. Just leave a thank you, and then one thing you're grateful for, and then yeah, I'll play some music as you guys type in what you guys are grateful for. After you type in what you're grateful for, feel free to leave the Zoom meeting already. Thank you everyone for coming. Hi. Oh, Cam, is it okay if you stop screen sharing already? Thank you. Yes. Okay.
I'm not exactly sure how to stop my screen share.
I don't know either, but it's okay. It's all right. Okay, so people are leaving their gratitude notes in the chat. Feel free to leave the room as you type in your gratitude.
Yeah, I'll share the slides.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm also grateful for Cam's learning bite. It was very, very insightful. Awesome.
Oops. Cool. Thanks, guys. I will also hop off. Have a
Bye-bye.
good evening. Bye.
Bye. I'm also gonna hop off.